In July, the calendar promised wheat. Instead, it delivered ice. Not a poetic chill, actual frost that blackened shoots in the field, a sky that looked sickly, and a sun that shone like it had been watered down. Here is the first lie disaster teaches you. Catastrophe doesn't arrive wearing a sign. It arrives wearing weather, and it asks you to pretend it's normal. But nothing about 1816 was normal. In the Northern Hemisphere, summer cracked. And the bill for that crack wasn't paid in gold. It was paid in bread, bodies, and silence. So here's the big question we're dragging through mud and archives. When the world breaks, does power rush to save people? Or does it rush to save authority by controlling blame, movement, and memory? Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Start in the places that kept diaries, because the state couldn't keep people warm. In New England, farmers wrote about frost in June and cold snaps that made planting a gamble and harvesting a joke. Across the Atlantic, parts of Europe watched rain and chill settle in like an occupying army. Contemporary accounts describe dry fog, a strange haze that dimmed the light, made the day feel wrong, and turned the sky into something you couldn't trust. This wasn't a single bad week. It was a season that refused to behave. And when seasons fail, society reveals what it really is. Not a story about kings and parliaments, but a supply chain with a moral face. Grain is not food in a crisis. It is the operating system of order. You can endure sermons with an empty stomach. You cannot endure policy. Because the moment harvests fail, prices become a weapon no one admits they're holding. Bread climbs out of reach, first for the poor, then for everyone who lives one paycheck from hunger. Livestock weaken because pasture doesn't grow. Families burn through their reserves. Then they sell what they swore they'd never sell. The crisis doesn't just make people suffer, it makes them choose which piece of their life to amputate. Notice how quickly the language changes. Officials don't write, "We are starving." They write, "crop failures, shortages, disturbances," as if naming death politely will make it smaller. And that is the second lie, that suffering is a statistic until it becomes a riot. The streets start to fill not with revolutionaries, but with parents who have done the math and found nothing left to cut. By the end of this part, you should feel the trap tightening, because the cold is only the first act. The real violence comes next. Markets that panic, laws that protect property before people, and governments that discover, almost with relief, that emergency can justify almost anything. If 1816 is the moment nature breaks the calendar, then 1817 will be the moment power decides what kind of society deserves to survive. And the question won't be, why did it get cold? The question will be, who gets to eat, who gets to move, and who gets blamed when the sky goes wrong? If you want to understand why 1816 felt like the world had been cursed, you have to stop thinking like a novelist and start thinking like the atmosphere, slow, layered, and indifferent to human schedules. Because the trigger wasn't a king's decree or a secret war. It was a mountain on an island most Europeans could not have placed on a map, detonating hard enough to rewrite sunlight. April 1815, Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia. Mount Tambora erupts with a force modern science classifies near the top of the scale. an event so violent it can push gas and ash into the stratosphere, above most of the weather that normally scrubs the sky clean. That detail matters. When material reaches the stratosphere, it doesn't fall out in a week like local smoke. It spreads, circulates, and lingers. Sulfur dioxide becomes sulfate aerosols, tiny reflective particles that don't need political preference to choose victims. They follow physics, winds, circulation patterns, and the uneven way the planet moves heat from equator to pole. This is why the timeline the conspiracy merchants mock is actually the signature of the mechanism. The eruption is in 1815, and the worst human pain peaks in 1816 and bleeds into 1817. That lag isn't suspicious. It's how the system works. Aerosols build, disperse, thicken into a thin global veil, and then interfere with sunlight, temperature gradients, and rainfall patterns. The atmosphere doesn't flip a switch. It changes the rules, and then it waits for societies to fail their own stress test. Now here's the part that matters politically. A couple degrees is not a couple degrees. Not when your world runs on muscle, horses, sail, and the math of stored grain. A modern city can import calories by rail in days. An 1816 village cannot. Its safety net is last year's barn and the local market, and both collapse when the sky refuses to cooperate. Cooling doesn't have to be uniform to be devastating. It only has to strike the wrong regions at the wrong time. During planting, during harvest, during the narrow windows when food becomes winter. And yes, the effects hit the Northern Hemisphere hard. That isn't a plot, it's geography. The Northern Hemisphere has more landmass, and land responds to radiative changes faster than oceans. Large continental interiors swing colder, and agriculture is less forgiving. A wet, cold summer is not romantic rain. It is rot in the field. It is grain that won't ripen. It is hay that can't dry. It is cattle that enter winter already starving. But Tambora didn't just cool. It destabilized. The same veil that dims the sun can rearrange circulation and precipitation, shifting where the rains fall and where drought bites. And that's where the year without a summer becomes more than a weather story. Because weather is what you endure. Pattern is what breaks you. A one-off storm is tragedy. A season that won't behave is governance crisis. So when people describe a strange sky, haze, dim light, sunsets that look bruised, they are not reporting magic. They are reporting aerosols and smoke-like effects at a distance, the sensory edge of a planetary process. But here is where we draw a hard line against the seductive lie. Evidence of haze is not evidence of a hidden chemical war, and a buried window is not proof of a wiped empire. Real catastrophes are already sufficient. You don't need cosmic enemies to explain hunger. You need one thing, a fragile system. And that is the point that should make you uncomfortable. Because if one volcano can tilt the climate just enough to kill harvests across continents, then the real question is not, how could this happen? The real question is why so many societies were built so close to the edge that a thin veil in the sky could push millions into desperation. In the next part, we go back to the ground, to diaries and streets, to dry fog and failed fields, to Lake Geneva, where the summer felt like imprisonment. And we watch culture react the way politics always does under stress, by inventing monsters, some in novels, some in laws. So, it doesn't have to name the one in the mirror. A climate shift doesn't announce itself with a proclamation. It leaks into your senses. First as inconvenience, then as dread, then as a new normal you did not consent to. In 1816, People didn't need scientific instruments to know something had changed. They could taste it. They could see it. They could watch a bright season turn dim, as if the sun had been demoted. In the northeastern United States, diaries and local reports describe a summer that behaved like a bad omen. Cold snaps arrived when they were supposed to be impossible. Frost in late spring and early summer turned planting into Russian roulette. Imagine being a farmer in a world without crop insurance, without refrigerated transport, without the modern luxury of importing calories across an entire continent in a week. You gamble your seed into soil because you have to. Then the sky takes your bet, smiles, and refuses to pay out. And above it all was the haze, what some contemporaries called a dry fog. Not the refreshing mist of morning, not the clean smell after rain, but a veil that made the day look sick. Sunlight dulled. Distance looked wrong. The world lost its normal contrast, like a painting left too long in smoke. This is the psychological violence of environmental disaster. It doesn't just threaten your stomach, it attacks your confidence in reality. When the sky stops behaving, belief becomes a scarce resource. Across the Atlantic, parts of Europe slid into the same unease. Cold and rain pressed down on fields that were supposed to be green and generous. Harvests failed not with theatrical explosions, but with quiet ruin. Grain that didn't mature, hay that wouldn't dry, vineyards and gardens reduced to mud and disappointment. That quiet matters. It's easier to mobilize against an obvious enemy than against a season. A foreign army can be named, a frosty June cannot. So people reached for older explanations, God's anger, fate, curse, because those at least came with a story. And power, watching this, learned a lesson it never forgets. When fear doesn't have a target, it becomes available for anyone to aim. Now move to Lake Geneva, to the villa on the water where a group of young writers expected a summer of conversation, romance, and sunlight. Instead, they found confinement. Mary Shelley, still young, still absorbing grief and ambition, looked out at days that wouldn't warm, skies that wouldn't clear, and a world that felt as if it had stepped backward into something older and harsher. The famous literary result is easy to summarize. Frankenstein, a monster stitched from dead parts, animated by human arrogance. But the political result is the one most people miss. Gothic wasn't just a fashion, it was an atmosphere. It was culture responding to a simple realization. Progress is fragile. Enlightenment can be dimmed. A bright century can be made to feel medieval by a thin veil in the sky. This is how catastrophe colonizes the imagination. When the environment becomes hostile, people don't merely suffer. They reinterpret what human beings are. They start telling stories about punishment, about unnatural forces, about bodies turned into warnings. And that matters because governments live downstream from imagination. The public mood becomes raw material for policy. If the crowd believes the world is under judgment, it will accept judgments from men. The economic chain is already tightening by now, even if the first riots haven't exploded yet. Because food is not just food, it is leverage. When harvests fail, the poor don't become hungry later. They become hungry first. They spend a larger fraction of their life on bread already. So any price rise is a sentence, not an inconvenience. Families begin to stretch meals, then skip them. Livestock becomes a liability because there's no pasture and no spare grain. People slaughter animals early, flooding markets briefly with meat, then collapsing into deeper scarcity when the animals are gone. Every choice is rational. Every choice makes the future worse. And notice what the official language does while this is happening. It minimizes. It abstracts. Inclement weather, poor harvest, disturbances. Words that keep responsibility floating, unclaimed. This is the beginning of the fight over memory. Because if the crisis is framed as a minor anomaly, then no one has to admit that society was engineered with no margin for error. No one has to admit that order was always paid for by someone else's hunger. Here is where the story stops being only about nature and becomes about power. In the absence of reliable harvests, governments confront a choice that reveals their true philosophy. Do they treat bread as a public necessity or as a commodity whose price must be respected? Do they protect people or property? Do they coordinate relief and distribution, or do they default to force when crowds gather? Catastrophe doesn't create cruelty from nothing. It exposes what was already there, waiting for permission. By the end of 1816, the sky has done its work, not by killing everyone instantly, but by pushing societies into a narrowing corridor where each month demands a harsher decision. And that's the turn you need to feel. The real monster of this story is not a volcano and not a fog. It's what happens when an anxious state realizes emergency is useful, because once exceptional times are declared, almost anything can be justified, especially against the people who are already starving. Next, we follow the hunger into the marketplace and the street, where bread becomes an instrument, and order is maintained not by compassion, but by bayonets. And we ask, without blinking, who that order is actually for. Cold is terrifying, but hunger is systematic. Weather can ruin a crop in a night. Hunger ruins a society by turning every human relationship into a transaction. And this is where the polite phrase crop failure stops being descriptive and starts being a cover story. Because when the harvest dies, the next killer isn't the sky. It's the market's arithmetic, applied to a population that cannot opt out. A failed summer doesn't just mean less food, it means less margin. In 1816, most households lived with a narrow buffer, a few months of stored grain, a little cash, some livestock, a local network that worked only when the roads worked. When the rains don't stop, hay can't dry. When hay can't dry, animals go into winter already starving. When animals starve, you lose milk, traction, fertilizer, your future harvest. And you lose it before you lose your last loaf. This is why famine isn't only no food. It's the collapse of the systems that make food possible. Now add the second layer, prices. The moment supplies tighten, grain becomes more than nutrition. It becomes power that can be stored, moved, withheld, and sold. The rich don't have to form a conspiracy to benefit. The rules do it for them automatically. A merchant with reserves can wait. A laborer cannot. A family living close to the edge does not adjust. It breaks. Bread prices rising by what looks like an economic statistic becomes, in practice, a decision about who gets to stay alive long enough for the next season. This is the moral trap at the center of the crisis. Governments talk about order. Markets talk about signals. Neither word feeds anyone. And when the poor begin to panic, the comfortable call it irrational. Until you notice the panic is not emotional. It is mathematical. People were doing the only calculation that matters. How many days of food remain, and what happens when that number hits 0. The competitor script loves the image of Germany. Peasants slaughtering dairy cattle because there is nothing to feed them, grass not growing, bread priced beyond human life. That image isn't just tragedy, it's the logic of scarcity. You kill the cow not because you want meat today, but because you cannot afford to keep it alive for tomorrow. You're liquidating your future to survive the week. And when thousands do it at once, you don't solve hunger, you deepen it. Milk disappears. Breeding stock vanishes. Next year's plow power weakens. Famine is a feedback loop that punishes the desperate for being desperate, and it spreads socially like a stain. First, rural households tighten belts. Then artisans in towns feel it, because hungry countryside buys less. Then urban workers feel it, because their wages don't rise with bread. Then public order begins to crack, because the state can manage disagreement. It struggles to manage hunger. Shops are stormed not as ideology, but as triage. Warehouses become symbols, not of wealth, but of insult. Stored grain behind a door looks like a deliberate choice to let children starve outside it. This is where the riot enters history, not as chaos, but as a language. If you cannot petition effectively, you gather. If you cannot gather safely, you shout. If shouting doesn't work, you take. Not because you are criminal by nature, but because the system has reduced you to an animal decision: eat or die. The same official who would ignore a complaint cannot ignore a crowd. And so famine teaches a brutal civic lesson. Visibility matters more than legitimacy. The script describes people eating grass, stripping bark from trees, using anything that can be swallowed. Whether every detail occurred in every region is less important than the pattern, because we know that subsistence crises reliably generate the same behaviors when people are cornered. What matters is the moral inversion. In civilized Europe, the enlightened century, the social contract shrinks to a loaf of bread. And when that loaf is priced out of reach, the philosophy of the era is tested in the gut. Then comes the third layer: disease. Hunger lowers resistance, crowding increases, movement accelerates, sanitation frays. Typhus and other fevers do not arrive as separate disasters. They ride famine like a carriage. This is why the crisis becomes so hard to measure cleanly in a simple number. People die. People flee. Records fail. Villages empty, not only through death, but through dispersion. Families dissolving into roads, into cities, into ships. And later, when historians try to compress this into a line, a climatic anomaly caused hardship. The line feels like violence, not because it's false, but because it's too small for what it covers. Now watch what power does under that pressure. It doesn't only search for grain, it searches for a story that preserves authority. Scarcity creates a temptation to treat hunger as a moral defect, not a systemic failure. To call the poor unruly, not starving. To label riot as criminality, not politics. Because if the problem is disorder, the solution is force. If the problem is hunger, the solution is redistribution. and redistribution always threatens someone important. This is the hinge of the whole narrative. Because the disaster did not merely reveal that nature can be cruel, it revealed that society had been built like a machine optimized for normal weather, efficient, profitable, and merciless when conditions shifted. A few degrees of cooling didn't kill millions by itself. The chain of decisions did. Who stored grain? Who controlled transport? Who set prices? Who had legal protection? Who had none? And once bread becomes leverage, the next move is almost predictable. The authorities respond the way states often respond when the crowd gathers. Not by feeding the hungry first, but by making hunger illegal to express. Martial law, troops, curfews, bayonets standing in for policy. In the next part, we go where the crisis becomes openly political. The street corner where a starving parent meets a soldier ordered to protect a warehouse, and both are told they serve order. When bread becomes unreachable, the state faces a choice that it cannot admit out loud. It can treat hunger as a public emergency, meaning food must move toward the starving even if it violates the comforts of property and normal prices. Or it can treat hunger as a threat to authority, meaning the starving must be managed like a hostile crowd. The second option is always easier to implement because it looks like strength. It also tells you what kind of civilization you're living in. The competitor script paints the scene in blunt strokes. Riots, warehouses stormed, martial law declared, shots in the streets. Strip away the melodrama, and the underlying pattern remains historically familiar. In subsistence crises, crowds don't gather because they love violence. They gather because they have discovered the limit of polite suffering. A market that prices you out is already violence, just slow and legal. Breaking a window is only the moment that violence becomes visible enough to frighten the respectable. Now look at the mechanics of order. A government can't command the sky, it can't negotiate with a cold summer, but it can command bodies. It can tell soldiers where to stand, which streets to block, which groups can assemble, which pamphlets can be printed, which rumors must be punished. This is the political psychology of disaster. Control migrates to the dimensions where control is possible. And once a state experiences the relief of that control, once it learns that emergency can silence debate, there's a danger it begins to prefer emergency. The moral cost shows up in the smallest details. A hungry crowd sees a warehouse as stored life. An official sees it as stored property. Those are not the same thing, and in 1816 and 1817, they collided in public view. The state's instinct is to prevent precedent. If one crowd can seize grain, then all crowds might. If law can be bent by hunger, then law is revealed as a tool rather than a sacred rule. So the state draws a line, not between hunger and relief, but between obedience and punishment. And then comes the ritual that repeats across history. The declaration that order must be maintained. Martial law is framed as necessity. Bayonets are framed as deterrence. Hunger riots are framed as criminality, not as a referendum on survival. The language itself is a weapon. Call people looters, and you are halfway to justifying shooting them. Call them starving families, and suddenly the warehouse looks like a moral scandal. Here's the part the romantic histories skip. In a crisis, legality doesn't disappear, it intensifies. The state issues proclamations, restrictions, authorizations, exemptions. An entire paper storm of control. Even if you never see the documents, you see the effect. Movement monitored, gatherings dispersed, punishment made exemplary. The state is not only fighting famine, it is fighting the idea that famine reveals the system's failure. If the public accepts that the system failed, then the public might demand structural changes, price controls, requisitions, redistribution, a new definition of what government owes its people. Those demands threaten the hierarchy far more than cold weather does. So violence becomes educational. A shot fired in a street is not only meant to stop one crowd, it is meant to instruct thousands who are watching. You can starve quietly, but you may not starve loudly. This is how famine becomes a philosophy lesson delivered through fear. The starving learn they are disposable. The comfortable learn that the state will protect property first. And the state learns something even more dangerous, that a crisis can be used to harden the public into obedience. None of this requires villains twirling moustaches. It requires incentives and institutions. Local officials fear being blamed for disorder. Merchants fear losing stock. Landowners fear precedent. And governments fear the one thing more than hunger, a mass public that realizes it has leverage when it moves together. So the crisis is managed the way empires manage borderlands: contain, suppress, divide. Relief, where it exists, is often conditional. Prove you deserve help. Prove you are not idle. Prove you are compliant. Hunger becomes a moral test administered by people who are not hungry. And this is where the human tragedy becomes structurally revealing. Because once you criminalize the desperate, you push them into the shadows, into theft, into flight, into crowded shelters, into dangerous crossings. You create the perfect conditions for the next wave of death to arrive wearing a different mask. Hunger weakens bodies. Repression concentrates them. Displacement moves them. Disease loves exactly that combination. The competitor script names typhus like a grim companion of famine, and that is not poetic exaggeration. It's epidemiology. In communities with malnutrition, crowding, and disruption, disease doesn't need conspiracy. It needs opportunity. People fleeing failed harvests compress into towns, into temporary housing, into ships. Hygiene collapses under pressure. Institutions that might have responded, local relief systems, charities, parish structures, are overwhelmed or uneven, and their unevenness becomes political. Who gets admitted? Who gets turned away? Who gets labelled outsider? Who gets blamed for bringing sickness? And blame is a currency in crisis. If you can pin suffering on a group, migrants, the poor, agitators, foreigners, you can preserve the legitimacy of the system itself. The crowd becomes the problem, not the shortage. Mobility becomes suspicious. Rumor becomes treason. And in the middle of that, ordinary people make a decision that looks personal, but is actually geopolitical. They leave. That decision is the pivot into the next part. Because once families begin to abandon fields and villages, the crisis stops being a bad season and becomes a demographic event, a reshuffling of populations that will later be misread as mysterious disappearance. The question isn't whether people vanished into thin air. The question is where they went, who recorded them, and who benefited from the silence when record-keeping failed. In the next part, famine's shadow steps forward as the second wave, sickness, quarantine instincts, and the politics of movement. Who is allowed to travel, who is trapped, and who gets declared contagion, simply for being poor. Famine rarely kills alone. It softens the body first, then invites a second predator to do the finishing work. In the wake of 1816's failed seasons, the world didn't just get poorer, it got weaker. And a weak society is not only vulnerable to sickness, it is vulnerable to the kind of politics sickness enables. Typhus, the old companion of cold, crowding, and desperation, surged through parts of the British Isles and continental Europe in the years after the worst harvests. Ireland is the cleanest example of the pattern because the island's poor were already living on the edge. A dense rural population, fragile margins, and a food system that could collapse into panic when the weather turned hostile. When crops fail, families move toward towns, toward ports, toward relatives, toward any rumor of work. They sleep in tighter spaces, share clothing and bedding, stretch hygiene until it snaps. Disease doesn't need a mastermind, it needs friction and proximity. But here is the confrontation. The history books often soften. The moment a disease is named, someone must decide what a human being becomes in the eyes of the state. Patient or threat, neighbor or contaminant. The most honest sentence you can say about epidemic policy is this: public health is never only medical. It is always a question of power over movement. Once fever spreads, every road becomes political. Travel becomes suspect. Strangers become evidence. The poor become guilty by default because they are visible. Where suffering concentrates, crowded housing, temporary shelters, docks, work sites, alleyways, and because they cannot self-isolate. Quarantine is easiest for those with spare rooms, spare money, and spare food. The wealthy can perform responsibility because they can afford it. The poor are asked to be responsible in a world that gives them no tools to comply. This is how compassion turns into paperwork. Relief is offered, but conditional. Aid is distributed, but not evenly. A family might receive a loaf, or it might receive a lecture. The difference is not purely moral, it is administrative. Officials must triage, and triage always reveals hidden hierarchies. Who counts as deserving? Who counts as idle? Who counts as foreign? Who counts as dangerous? And if you want to understand the political psychology of this period, watch the language tighten around the poor like a noose. Hunger becomes vagrancy. Movement becomes vagabondage. Sickness becomes uncleanliness. A catastrophe created by climate is reinterpreted as a flaw in character. In Ireland and elsewhere, this logic hardens into institutions. Temporary fever sheds and local containment measures appear. Parish and municipal systems strain under demand. In practice, the poor encounter a state that has learned to treat them not as citizens with claims, but as bodies to be managed. And management has a rhythm: register, inspect, confine, punish. Even when the intention is protective, the experience can feel carceral. For your safety sounds different when you are hungry, sick, and powerless. Now step back and feel what the state is learning. During food riots, it learned that crowds are dangerous. During epidemics, it learns something even more intoxicating: that extraordinary control can be justified as science. The bayonet was obvious. The quarantine order feels cleaner, more modern, more rational, but the function overlaps. Both restrict movement, both discipline the poor, both protect the stability of the city. And this is where the moral ledger gets ugly. A government can sincerely aim to reduce disease, while simultaneously enjoying the increased authority it gains over everyday life. Meanwhile, the catastrophe continues to rearrange the population. Families that might have stayed put are forced onto roads. Some will die in their villages. Some will die in towns. Some will die on ships. And some will survive by leaving. This is the origin of the demographic mystery the competitor script turns into theatre. They say, millions vanished. The truth is more banal and more cruel. Millions became difficult to count. Death and displacement blur together because record-keeping breaks precisely when it matters most. A parish register doesn't follow you onto a ship. A local census doesn't capture a family that walked away and never returned. The archive develops holes, and those holes invite storytellers to fill them with whatever myth pays best. But the real story is already strong enough. The second wave of the crisis is not simply disease, it is the way disease accelerates social sorting. Epidemics don't strike evenly. They follow vulnerability. They punish crowded housing, malnutrition, unstable work, and poor sanitation, the very conditions created by the failed harvests. So, even when the suffering is natural, its distribution is political. The poor die in higher numbers, not because they are inferior, but because the system placed them in the path of the blade. And then comes the quiet violence of stigma. If your neighborhood is labeled infected, trade avoids you. If your family is labeled sick, employers avoid you. If you are labeled a vagrant, police harass you. Every label reduces your options, and reduced options push you into more dangerous spaces. This is how a crisis becomes self-reinforcing. Hunger produces movement. Movement produces crowding. Crowding produces disease. Disease produces repression and stigma. Repression produces more movement. The loop tightens until a society begins to treat a portion of its population as disposable for the sake of stability. By the end of this part, you should see the shift. The catastrophe is no longer only a story about climate and crops. It is a story about borders, some drawn on maps, some drawn in streets, some drawn in the human imagination between us and them. And once a government learns to control bodies in the name of safety, it becomes easier to control bodies in the name of anything. In the next part, we follow the most consequential decision ordinary people make under that pressure. They leave. Across roads and oceans, they gamble on migration as a form of survival. And that movement, messy, undocumented, disease-haunted, will later be misread as disappearance. The question we carry forward is simple. When the poor flee a collapsing world, who records them? Who erases them? And who profits from the blank spaces they leave behind? When a society can't guarantee bread, it starts exporting people. Not as a policy written neatly on parchment, but as a human reflex that becomes a demographic fact. First, the men leave for seasonal work, then the older children, then entire families with what they can carry, because the alternative is to stay and watch the arithmetic of hunger win. The competitor script calls this disappearance, as if millions simply evaporated. That's the seductive lie of bad history. It turns movement into magic. The truth is uglier and far more human. People didn't vanish. They slipped out of the places that kept records. They crossed parish lines, county lines, imperial borders, and ocean routes that turned a name into a rumor. Death took some, disease took others, and the rest became a category the state has always struggled to count: the displaced. In Ireland, the pressure was not philosophical, it was physical. A failed or stunted harvest doesn't just reduce calories, it reduces choices. You sell furniture to buy grain. You sell tools to buy grain. You sell the cow that would have fed you next year to buy grain now. Then you look around and realize the village is no longer an economy, just a waiting room for starvation. So, you leave. The competitor script calls it a great exodus. And while the exact scale is easy to exaggerate, the pattern is real. A surge of movement outward, toward ports, toward America, toward anywhere that still carried the scent of work. But migration is never a clean rescue. It's a filter. The strong reach the dock. The weak stay behind. Then the strong discover the dock is another kind of trap. Crowded lodging, opportunistic landlords, recruiters selling passages like lottery tickets. You board ships that are less ark than gamble, holds packed tight, hygiene collapsing, fever traveling with you. Typhus doesn't care about hope. It rides the same desperation. So even when the journey ends in survival, it begins in risk. Now look at the other side of the ocean, where New England had already tasted the absurdity of snow in a season that should have been warm. Farmers there didn't need foreign stories to understand what failure looks like. They watched their own fields turn unreliable, watched neighbors go bankrupt, watched local markets stiffen. And when you combine local distress with incoming migrants, you get the most combustible mixture in any society: scarcity plus outsiders. A crisis that begins as weather becomes identity politics in less time than it takes a crop to fail. This is where the state's hand tightens again, because movement threatens more than wages. It threatens control. A stationary population can be taxed, conscripted, policed, and categorized. A moving population turns governance into chasing smoke. So authorities respond the way they always do when people move without permission. They invent administrative gravity, settlement rules, vagrancy enforcement, pass requirements in some places, border checks where borders exist, workhouses, poor relief, and local responsibility become tools, not only to help, but to confine. Because to help the poor is one thing, to allow the poor to roam is another. A hungry migrant isn't just a mouth. To an anxious local government, he is an unpredictable political unit, and the public absorbs the lesson quickly. When conditions are stable, tolerance is cheap. When bread is scarce, tolerance becomes expensive, and people start asking who deserves to eat. That question sounds moral, but it is usually economic fear dressed as virtue. It is the beginning of complicity. Ordinary people consenting to harsher policies because those policies promise stability. Crisis doesn't only reveal cruelty at the top, it manufactures it in the middle, where citizens decide whether the suffering of others is their problem. Now return to the competitor's favorite claim, the demographic hole. It's true that the years around 1816 to 1818 and the recovery afterward produced confusing population signals. Spikes in mortality, surges in movement, local collapses in record keeping, people relocating internally, and people leaving for good. But that is precisely why you should distrust clean numbers thrown like bricks. When a historian, or worse, a YouTuber, tells you exactly 10 million vanished, ask, from which registry? Whose census? What definition of vanished? Dead? Migrated? Not recorded? A crisis produces missing data the way a fire produces smoke. And missing data is a playground for anyone selling a grand secret. Because here is the uncomfortable possibility that doesn't require fantasy. A disaster can be enormous and still be administratively minimized. Not because a council of villains met in a dark room, but because governments and elites share a simple incentive: stability. If you record the full scale of breakdown, you invite panic, blame, and demands for redistribution. If you compress the catastrophe into a bad year, you preserve legitimacy. A footnote is not an accident. It can be a strategy. And migration helps that strategy. When the hungry leave, they stop being a local problem. They stop being visible in the street. They stop being a riot risk. They become someone else's issue, someone else's statistic. The sending region loses people. The receiving region gains them. And in the shuffle, the moral responsibility becomes diffuse. The suffering is real, but accountability dissolves into geography. This is the pivotal turn of the entire story. By 1817, the crisis is no longer just climate. It is a redistribution of bodies. Labor moves, populations mix, old communities thin out, new ones form under pressure. And when that happens, the winners of the next decade inherit a gift. A public that is exhausted, scattered, and ready to accept a simpler narrative than the truth. In the next part, we confront the most seductive proof that alternative storytellers cling to: the half-buried windows, the sunken first floors, the sense that whole cities were covered over. We'll separate what floods and rebuilding can genuinely explain from what myth exploits. And we'll ask a sharper question than, was there mud? Why do people want a buried world story so badly that they'll trade evidence for meaning? If you want to understand how a real catastrophe gets hijacked into a fake apocalypse, don't start with a volcano. Start with a sidewalk. In St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in old European cities that tourists film like sacred relics, you can stand in front of an ornate building and notice something that feels wrong in your bones. Windows that look too large for a cellar. Arches that suggest a first floor, but they sit half buried at shoe level. Doorways that seem to lead into the ground. The competitor script weaponizes that image. It says, this is proof of a sudden mud flood that buried entire cities by 2 to 3 meters. Proof of a hidden global catastrophe. Proof of an erased civilization. It's a perfect conspiracy object because it's visible, repeatable, and emotionally satisfying. You don't need to read archives. You can just point the camera at the stone and say, look. But stone can tell the truth and still be used to lie. Let's separate the parts that are plausible from the parts that are propaganda. Yes, cities experience floods, sometimes severe ones. Yes, cold, wet years can increase flooding risk in certain regions, especially when snowpack, ice, or prolonged rainfall interact with rivers and low-lying districts. Yes, after major disruptions, cities often enter periods of aggressive rebuilding, regrading streets, raising embankments, filling low areas, covering old drains, and layering new infrastructure over damaged old networks. That's not scandal. That's how urban survival works. And yes, archaeologists routinely find older street levels below modern ones. They find wooden pavements, older foundations, household objects, and construction phases stacked like pages. Not because someone poured a bucket of mud over Europe, but because a city is a machine that rebuilds itself while still running. Fires happen, wars happen, roads are repaved, sewers are installed, rivers are channeled, then covered, neighborhoods are leveled, then raised to fix drainage. In many cities, what people call cellars now were not designed as glamorous living rooms. Yet, they can still inherit big openings, arches, and high ceilings because buildings are modified over time, repurposed, and adapted to new street grades. Here's the part the competitor script gets right in spirit, but wrong in conclusion. Cultural layer is real, but it's not one single process. It's many processes piled together. Slow accumulation from daily life exists. So does deliberate landfill used to level and drain. So does debris from demolition. So do sediments from localized flooding. So does post-disaster reconstruction that raises street profiles to keep basements dry. When someone tells you there is only one explanation, either it's just dirt or it's a global mud flood, they're not doing history. They're selling comfort, one simple story that makes the world feel legible. Now, look at why the mud flood story feels irresistible. It turns ordinary urban complexity into a single dramatic event. It gives you a villain. They hid it. It gives you a clean timeline. After 1816, everything was buried. It gives you a satisfying reason the past feels foreign, because it literally is under our feet. It's the same psychological mechanism that makes people claim an erased empire must explain every gap in records. When you've been taught that history is a neat parade of dates and rulers, the real messiness of climate, infrastructure, and migration feels like a betrayal. Myth steps in to restore a sense of order. One cause, one cover-up, one revelation. But the truth is harsher and more interesting. If your city's street level rose, it might be because city administrators chose to raise it. Not to hide history, but to keep the city functioning. In wet zones, raising streets is a drainage strategy. In river cities, building embankments changes flow and sediment dynamics. When you install sewers, you often regrade. When you expand carriage traffic, you level slopes. When repeated floods threaten lower floors, you treat the lowest level as expendable and redesign entrances above. None of that needs a continent-wide sludge wave. It needs budgets, labor, and the ugly reality that it's easier to build over a problem than to perfectly restore what was there. So what about the claims of uniform 2 to 3 meter burial everywhere, all at once? This is where the story stops being archaeology and starts being performance. Uniformity is the tell. Cities are not uniform. Rivers are not uniform. Floods are not uniform. Even within one city, deposition varies by block. Low points collect more, high points less. A claim that the same thickness of mud sits across an entire continent is not evidence. It's a desire for symmetry. Nature does not grant symmetry on that scale without leaving unmistakable regional signatures, stratigraphic fingerprints, and a mountain of consistent documentation across many independent sites. What we actually find in real urban stratigraphy is patchwork. Phases, layers, rebuilds, fires, fills, repairs, expansions. Human history written as construction. And that matters, because the competitor script is trying to swap one reality for another. The real catastrophe of 1816 to 1817 was already enough. Crop failure, price shocks, riots, disease, migration, and the tightening grip of states over movement and survival. But that reality is politically uncomfortable because it implies something about governance. That people died not only because the sun dimmed, but because society had been engineered to let the weakest fall first. A mudflood myth replaces that discomfort with spectacle. It turns moral questions into geology cosplay. So here is the confrontation. When you see those half-buried windows, don't ask, what secret are they hiding? Ask, what conditions made a city decide that burying the past was cheaper than saving it? Because that question brings us back to the big question. Catastrophe creates damage. Power decides what gets repaired, what gets repurposed, and what gets forgotten. In the next part, we move from sidewalks to atlases, because the most effective erasure isn't done with mud. It's done with names. And once you understand how maps turn land into administration, you'll see why Tartaria didn't need to be destroyed by a disaster to vanish from paper. It only needed to become inconvenient to the people who were drawing the borders. If the sidewalk is where myths begin, the map is where they become policy. The competitor script points to a real object, old European atlases, and then performs a sleight of hand. It shows the word Tartary, or Tartaria, sprawled across huge portions of Asia on 17th and 18th century maps, sometimes with decorative symbols, sometimes with borders that look confident. Then it flips to early 19th century maps, where the label fades, fragments, or disappears, replaced by more specific administrative names tied to empires. And it asks you to feel the drama. An empire erased, a civilization wiped, a silence engineered. Here's what's true. The label existed. Here's what's also true. Labels are not states. A map is not a census. A cartographer's certainty is often a design choice, not a political reality on the ground. Tartary was, for centuries, a European shorthand, an umbrella term for vast regions of northern and central Asia that were poorly understood in Western Europe. The term bundled many peoples, polities, and geographies into one convenient box. It was a way of saying, here be the lands beyond our reliable knowledge. That's not insulting. It's how pre-modern mapping worked. Maps were part navigation tool, part rumor management, part political brochure. When knowledge was limited, broad labels filled the void. So, why does it look like Tartaria disappears? Because the 19th century is when that void shrinks. Not because a hidden empire was buried, but because state capacity and surveying explode forward. Empires didn't just conquer territory, they measured it, classified it, and renamed it into legibility. And legibility is power. If you can count a region, you can tax it. If you can draw it, you can claim it. If you can name it in your language, you can begin to own it in your law. This is the deeper story the competitor script accidentally brushes against. Cartography is governance. A map doesn't merely reflect reality, it creates a version of reality that can be administered. When the Russian Empire expands its administrative reach eastward over the long 18th and 19th centuries, it doesn't only send soldiers and settlers, it sends clerks, surveyors, decrees, new provinces, new names. Siberia becomes a category of rule, not a foggy edge of the world. Steppe zones become gubernias, oblasts, lines on paper that justify movement of people and resources. And yes, in the wake of crisis, after famine, disease and displacement, administration becomes easier in some places, not harder. That's the part no one wants to say plainly. Catastrophe can clear resistance by exhausting it. A population that is hungry and scattered has less energy to fight bureaucratic absorption. A region struggling to survive may accept a new authority that promises order, grain, or protection, not because they're weak, but because they're cornered. It's the same logic you saw on the streets during riots. When stability becomes scarce, even harsh stability can look like rescue. This is where the competitor script's Operation Oblivion becomes unnecessary as an explanation, but still useful as a metaphor. They imagine archives sealed and names erased by villainous design. In reality, something more ordinary happens, and that ordinariness is what should chill you. Names change because regimes change. Borders change because empires consolidate. Records go missing because institutions break under strain, because local archives burn, because papers rot, because administration is uneven, because the state only documents what it values. Silence doesn't always require censorship. Often it requires indifference. But don't misunderstand. Indifference can function like censorship when it consistently protects the same interests. If official narratives minimize suffering, calling a subsistence crisis a bad year, compressing mass migration into labor movement, treating outbreaks as local inconveniences, then the lived catastrophe is effectively erased without a single secret meeting. Memory is managed through framing, through what is printed, through what is taught, through what is treated as important history versus background noise. This is why Tartaria is such a powerful hook for people who feel cheated by official stories. It offers a single grand answer to 1,000 small confusions. It's a myth that pretends to restore agency. Something was taken from us. And sometimes that feeling is justified, even if the object is wrong. What was taken was not necessarily an empire. It was attention. It was the names of the poor who died quietly, and the choices that made them die first. So here's the confrontation I want you to hold. You don't need a buried superstate to accuse power of rewriting. Power rewrites every time it redraws a border without naming who bled for it. Every time it renames a river without asking who lived by it. Every time it turns a crisis into a footnote so no one asks why the system had no margin. And that brings us back to the big question. Because the map is the cleanest expression of the state's instinct under stress. Simplify, standardize, control. A messy world becomes legible. A legible world becomes governable. And a governable world becomes easier to extract from. The competitor script wants you to believe the great crime is that an empire disappeared from maps. The deeper crime might be simpler, that millions of ordinary people were turned into background data for a story about states and borders. Weather broke the harvest. Markets broke the poor. Disease broke the weak. migration broke the records. And then, power arrived with ink and administration and called the new arrangement normal. So the question that should haunt you going into the final act isn't, was Tartaria real? It's sharper and more dangerous to the comfortable. When catastrophe reshapes society, who gets to decide what counts as history? The diarist freezing in 1816, the mother queuing for bread, the migrant coughing in a ship's hold, or the institutions that survived and wrote the textbooks? Here is the most dangerous part of this whole history. The catastrophe was real. The suffering was massive. And yet the memory can still be made small. Not because a shadow council ordered everyone to forget, but because forgetting is often the cheapest way a society protects itself, and the most convenient way power protects its legitimacy. A disaster big enough to shake continents creates a question that can't be allowed to grow teeth. If the system failed this badly, what else is it lying about? So the system learns to narrate the failure as an exception, not an indictment. That is why the phrase "year without a summer" is both accurate and anesthetic. It names the anomaly, but it also packages it as a curiosity, like a weird storm you bring up at dinner. It becomes climate trivia, a strange year, an interesting footnote, a small museum label, and that packaging is political. Because the moment you treat it as a quirky weather story, you don't have to confront the moral physics that turned weather into death. The price mechanisms, the uneven relief, the policing of hunger, the way the poor were exposed and the wealthy buffered. So, who owns the disaster story? Start with the simplest truth. Disasters create competing narratives immediately. The starving tell one story, the merchants tell another, local officials tell a third, central governments prefer a fourth, religious authorities interpret it as judgment, economic authorities interpret it as market correction. Every narrative is a bid for control over blame, and blame is the currency that decides whether anything changes. For ordinary people, the story is visceral. The sky turned wrong, food vanished, prices rose, bodies weakened, neighbors left or died. But for institutions, the story must be manageable. It must preserve the idea that the state is competent, that the market is rational, that society is stable, that the moral order still holds. So, the language is domesticated. Hardship, disturbances, poor harvest, temporary difficulty. Notice how these terms act like a fence. They keep the emotional truth from spilling into political consequences. And trauma helps the fence hold. Collective trauma produces denial as a survival strategy. People who live through a period of hunger don't always want to retell it in detail. They want to move forward. They want normal. They want bread on the table and quiet nights. That desire is human. But it has a side effect. It creates a gap where official stories can settle like dust and become the only story. Now consider who has the tools to fix a narrative in place. Not the peasants, not the migrants, not the sick. The tools belong to those who print, archive, legislate, and teach. When administrations survive a crisis, they don't just rebuild roads and embankments. They rebuild meaning. They decide which reports are official, which deaths are counted, which movements are framed as migration instead of exile, which riots are framed as criminality instead of hunger politics. And here is the most confrontational point. Even when authorities aren't intentionally lying, their perspective is structurally biased. A bureaucrat documents what can be administered: harvest yields, prices, tax shortfalls, public order. A bureaucrat does not easily document humiliation, despair, the slow violence of malnutrition, the moral injury of watching your child starve while grain sits behind a guarded door. The archive is not a neutral mirror, it's a machine that turns human life into categories, useful to rule. That is why alternative myths flourish afterward. The competitor script's obsession with a buried empire is a symptom of a real wound. People sense the archive is incomplete. They sense official narratives are too smooth. They see physical anomalies, sunken windows, layered streets, renamed places, and they feel the past has been edited. They're not wrong to feel that, but they often grab the wrong explanation because it offers certainty and drama. A single villain, a single erased empire, a single grand cover-up. The truth is more uncomfortable because it indicts more people. The truth is that forgetting can be a collaboration between trauma and convenience. Ordinary people want to stop reliving terror. Elites want to stop being blamed for it. Institutions want to preserve the myth of stability. The result is the same. A catastrophe becomes a line item. And once a society learns it can compress suffering into trivia, it learns something else. It can do it again. This is the moral legacy of 1816 to 1817 that rarely gets named. It's not only that a volcano can dim the sun, it's that the social system, when stressed, reveals who it is willing to sacrifice, and then tells a story that makes that sacrifice disappear. But we're not finished, because after the worst of the crisis, a new world begins to assemble on top of the old one. States do not merely recover, they often grow stronger. They expand administrative reach, they build infrastructure, they refine public health measures, they learn to monitor weather and manage markets more aggressively. Some of that saves lives, some of it tightens control. And catastrophe becomes an accelerator of modern governance, both its mercy and its coercion. So, here's your open loop going into the next part. If disaster made states more capable, did it make societies more humane? Or did it teach governments that emergency is the perfect excuse to expand power, so that the next time the sky turns wrong, the first priority isn't feeding people, but managing them? After a catastrophe, people don't just rebuild houses, they rebuild rules. And the rules that survive tend to belong to whoever kept their hands on the levers when everyone else was starving. By the late 1810s, the worst shocks of the year without a summer era began to loosen. Not because the world suddenly became kind, but because societies adapted in the only way they could, by hardening. The competitor script wants a clean rupture. Old world dies, new world begins, buried empires, erased maps. Real history is more surgical. The old world doesn't die in one dramatic scene. It is amputated in pieces, and the new world grows in the empty spaces the amputations create. This is what catastrophe accelerates, or state capacity. The ability to see, count, move, police, and supply. Start with the obvious. Governments begin to treat food and infrastructure as matters of stability, not mere commerce. After subsistence crises, officials learn that bread is political fuel. When it runs out, crowds appear. When crowds appear, legitimacy shakes. So, states become more interested in monitoring harvests, controlling grain movement, regulating markets in certain moments, improving transport, expanding storage, and, crucially, improving the ability to intervene. Intervention can look like relief. It can also look like repression. The same apparatus serves both. Transport is a quiet revolution here. When roads, canals, and later railways expand and improve, famine becomes less local and less lethal, because calories can move. But transport also makes extraction easier. An improved network doesn't just move grain to hungry cities, it also moves taxes, troops, and administrative orders into the countryside. Connectivity is salvation and surveillance in the same breath. The state becomes more present everywhere, not always as help, often as a hand that can reach you. Public health evolves under similar tension. Epidemics following famine teach administrations that disease is not only God's will, it's a management problem. Quarantine practices, reporting, sanitation efforts, and institutional responses gain new momentum. This can genuinely save lives. It can also normalize control over bodies, registration, inspection, confinement, travel restrictions. The same logic that protects a city from fever can be repurposed to protect a regime from unrest. Emergency measures have a way of becoming habits. And then there is knowledge. Catastrophe is a brutal teacher. It pushes societies to observe weather more seriously, to correlate patterns, to refine explanations. A volcanic mechanism like Tambora's aerosol veil becomes, over time, part of a more scientific understanding of climate anomalies. That progress matters, but it also produces a new kind of authority. Experts who can translate the sky into policy, and governments that can justify decisions by invoking science. Again, this can be life-saving, and it can be weaponized. The question is never, is science good? The question is, who controls its application, and who bears the cost? Now the philosophical core. Disasters don't only reveal the cruelty of nature, they reveal the distribution of protection. A state that can intervene tends to intervene first where it fears disorder most. Major cities, trade hubs, centers of power. The rural poor, dispersed and quieter, often receive less attention until they move, riot, or die loudly enough to become politically inconvenient. This is how a crisis shapes the future map of inequality. Regions that recover faster attract investment and administrative focus. Regions that hollow out become sources of labor, migration, and extraction. Suffering becomes a sorting process. This is also where memory is formally manufactured. When institutions expand, they also expand documentation. New surveys, new administrative divisions, standardized naming, clearer maps, improved statistics. To the public, this looks like modernization, and it is, partly. But modernization also consolidates the story of who the world belongs to. Naming is ownership, counting is claim, mapping is command. The more legible the territory becomes, the more governable it becomes, and the more easily it can be integrated into imperial and national projects. So when the competitor script gestures at the 1820s and 1830s as a period where everything gets renamed, it's touching a real phenomenon, but misreading its cause. Renaming doesn't require a buried empire. It requires administrative ambition. A state that survived crisis is a state that understands how fragile order is and is determined to prevent the crowd from holding it hostage again. So, It strengthens itself. It rationalizes. It standardizes. It draws lines. It becomes more capable. And capability has a moral character that depends on who directs it. Here's the confrontation that should sting. Sometimes catastrophe produces reforms that genuinely reduce death in future crises. Better transport, better coordination, better health responses can reduce suffering. But those reforms are rarely free. They often come with expanded coercive power, policing of the poor, stricter controls on movement, deeper surveillance, new categories that define who is deserving and who is dangerous. The state learns to feed and to discipline using the same infrastructure, and ordinary people, exhausted by hunger and instability, often consent to this trade without ceremony. Because stability feels like mercy. Because the memory of riot and fever makes order feel sacred. This is the psychology of complicity in the aftermath. You accept stronger control because you fear the return of chaos. The state doesn't have to force you to surrender liberties. It only has to remind you what it felt like when bread disappeared. So, we arrive at the final threshold. The sky turned wrong. Markets turned cruel. Disease turned mobile. Migration turned the archive into holes. And then, states turned stronger. That is the arc. Which brings us to the resolution. If power grew in the aftermath, what exactly did it learn from 1816? Did it learn humility? That civilization needs margins, empathy, resilience? Or did it learn a colder lesson? That emergency is a tool, that controlling food and movement controls people, and that memory itself can be managed the way streets are regraded, building over the inconvenient layers. In the final part, we close the ledger and answer the big question without conspiracy and without softness. We name the mechanism of forgetting, and we name the price. Not only the bodies lost in the cold years, but the political habits formed in their shadow. Let's close the open loop we opened with midsummer frost. Not with romance, not with a secret empire, with the actual mechanism that turns catastrophe into power. The year without a summer was real. Tambora's eruption was real. The dimmed sun, the failed harvests, the hunger, the disease, the migration. Real. The myth is what people do when the real story is too morally expensive. They invent a single villain or a buried civilization so they don't have to look at the system that sacrificed the poor by design. So here is the answer to the big question. When the world breaks, power's first instinct is rarely to save people as people. Its first instinct is to save authority by controlling bread, controlling movement, and controlling memory. Sometimes that authority delivers relief. Sometimes it delivers bayonets. But the logic is the same. The state stabilizes itself first because a state that admits it is helpless risks being replaced. That isn't cynicism. It's a description of incentives. In 1816, nature delivered the initial blow, but the body count was negotiated afterward, by markets and policies. A thin veil in the sky does not automatically become mass death. It becomes mass death when societies are built without margin and governed with hierarchy. When grain is treated primarily as a commodity, the poor pay first. When relief is conditional, the desperate become criminals. When mobility is punished, disease spreads in crowded traps. When archives are uneven, the lost become uncounted. The catastrophe doesn't erase names by magic. It erases them by pushing people out of record-keeping systems, then letting official narratives shrink what happened into a manageable anecdote. That is the political psychology of disaster. Fear wants a story. Authority wants a story it can survive. And the simplest story for authority is always the same. This was an anomaly. No one is responsible. We endured. We moved on. It is the perfect sedative. It turns structural failure into weather trivia. Now look at what grew in the aftermath. States became more capable, more data, more mapping, more standardization, more control over movement, more infrastructure, more public health procedures. Some of that was mercy. It reduced deaths in later crises, but some of it was consolidation. Catastrophe made governance more invasive because emergency made invasion acceptable. People who had tasted chaos consented to stronger hands because stability felt like salvation. And power learned the most valuable lesson of all. In an emergency, people trade rights for bread, and they do it quickly. This is why you don't need a grand censorship plot to explain why the catastrophe is often treated lightly. Memory management can be unconscious and still function like control. Trauma wants to forget. Elites want to minimize blame. Institutions document what is useful to rule, not what is true to live. The result is the same. A massive event becomes a couple of lines, while the real moral ledger, the question of who paid and who profited, remains unsettled. So what should you take away if you refuse both comforting official footnotes and comforting conspiracies? First, the world you live in is built on layered crises, not metaphorically, literally, in streets and buildings, in regraded roads and repurposed floors, in renamed places and standardized maps. Those layers are not proof of a secret. They are proof that societies repeatedly choose to build over pain instead of accounting for it. Second, catastrophe is a test of philosophy. It asks whether a society treats survival as a right or a privilege. In 1816 to 1817, the answer was often brutal. Survival was allocated by money, by proximity to power, and by compliance. Law protected property more reliably than it protected bodies. That is not an accusation against one nation. It is a recurring pattern in how hierarchies behave under stress. Third, and this is the most confrontational, disaster creates opportunities, not cosmic opportunities, but political ones. When people are hungry, exhausted, displaced, and frightened, they become easier to manage. They accept simplified stories. They accept new borders. They accept new rules. And they stop asking what the previous system owed them. That is how a thin veil in the sky can help thicken the veil over a memory. So, if you want the real forbidden lesson of 1816, it isn't that an empire was buried. It's that the modern world learned how to metabolize mass suffering and keep going by turning it into background noise. The ledger of that era is not closed because the question keeps returning in every crisis since. When the sky goes wrong, when markets snap, when disease spreads, when migration surges, do we protect people, or do we protect the idea of order? We know what happened then. The only question is whether we recognize the pattern now, before we build another century on top of another layer of forgotten bodies.